So you're about to buy a house or you're about to sell a house and you're wondering how the principal residence tax exemption applies. Well, this is what we're going to look into in this video. So if your house is treated as personal property, you may be eligible to save some of the taxes owed due to the principal residence tax exemption. The thing that's important to note from the principal residence tax exemption is it has to be a residence. So if you own a piece of land for 10 years and then sell it and there was never a residence built on it, well, you cannot have it as a principal residence tax exemption. Even if you say, hey, I was camping on there, I had my trailer, I had my truck, whatever, I was sleeping on the property, it doesn't apply. You have to have it treated as your principal residence. And when it comes to principal residences, you can only have one principal residence per couple. So you can't say, my girlfriend has a principal residence and I have a principal residence. If you're seen as partners from a law perspective, you can only have one principal residence. Why is this principal residence so important? Is because it leads to the possibility that you may not owe any income taxes on all of the gains that you've made during the time you had this property. So let's say you bought a house for $200,000 and then 10 years later, there's this massive boom. The sector that you're in is super interesting and you sell it for $1 million. That whole $800,000 is subject to income taxes typically, and because these would be seen as capital gains because you're seen as a personal property, well, 50% of those gains, so $400,000 would be eligible for owing taxes on. Well, if it was your principal residence for this whole time, you owe nothing to the government. Since 2016, you have to make a declaration to the government when you sell a residence to declare that this was your principal residence. And how does it work? So when it comes time to declaring your principal residence on your income taxes, make sure to fill out TI 2020 and TI 2091, which are two of the official documents that you have to include with your income tax report. And those will be included in the link below. Before we run into some of the calculations, there's a few details that are important to note. First off, when you declare principal residence, this has to be treated as a residence. And what we mean here is that you cannot claim capital cost allowance or other kind of expenses on this property, because that would mean that this property has been treated in some shape or form as a business. So if you start doing that, it may cut away your possibility of treating it as your principal residence. There's a few articles linked at the bottom. Take a look and try to see what makes more sense for you in terms of running a business or claiming expenses in your property if you expect large capital gains when you sell it. You really want to make sure to be sheltered as much as possible from owing any income taxes on those. Another thing that's important to note is that typically this principal residence, they treat it as if the property, the land associated to it, should have a maximum of, relatively speaking, half a hectare or 1.25 acres. So this means that if you buy like a 500-acre piece of land and you put a house on it, and then 10 years later you sell it at a massive profit, well, they'll justify and they'll say, well, there's part of this profit that is exempt from taxes that is due to this principal residence, but there's a lot of this property that is not exempt because it was just land, undeveloped land that you kind of sold off and it should still be taxable. The only way to get around this of having a bigger property and not having to owe taxes on that property is if you can justify that it wasn't possible for you to subdivide. So let's say you're in a situation where you have a piece of property, but because you have such a small passageway on the road, you can't subdivide it anymore, or there's other limitations that prohibits you from subdividing this property into smaller lots and having other buildable possibilities on it. Or if it's green zone, it's agricultural, that's a different story because it's seen as business. But like if there's things that prevent you from developing this property even more and making use profitably of the rest of the land, well, then it could be included as your principal residence tax exemption. But typically they'll treat it as a small piece of property. So those are some of the things that are important to note. And when it comes to designating a principal residence, you don't have to live there year round. You or one of your family members has to live there part of the year. So it could be a cottage, it could even be in another country, and that's subject for another discussion. But generally speaking, if you live part of the year there or someone in your family does, it can be declared your principal residence. But per couple, you can only have one principal residence. So let's say you buy a piece of property in year 2000, and then 5 years later you buy another piece of property, and then in 2010 you sell one of the two off, the first one, let's say. Well, you have to ask yourself, within this 10-year time frame, do I want to declare property 1 as being my principal residence? Naturally you would for the time that was your only residence, but when you had both of them, do you still want to declare this one, or do you want to declare the other one? And the big thing here is it's not based on, well, this is where I work and this is the residence I spend most time in and the other one's just my cottage. Well, actually, it may make more financial sense for you to say, well, my cottage was my principal residence because that's the one that gained more value in a short period of time on a yearly basis. So you want to be strategic in all of this and knowing which one you use to declare as your principal residence. So there's a little calculation here involved, which is the number of years you declare it as your principal residence plus 1 over the amount of years that you've owned this building. And why is there this little plus 1 in this category? Well, it's all because normally, if you imagine that you don't own two buildings at the same time, well, maybe from 2000 to 2010, you own property 1, and then from 2010 to 2020, you own property 2. Well, in that 2010, you have two properties. And if it wasn't for this plus 1, it'd be hard to say that you've used only this property as your principal residence. You only had one residence at its time, and you should be fully exempt. So in that example, you would say, well, year 2000 up to 2009, this was my principal residence. And then in 2010, that would be your plus 1. You would then get 100% exemption, and then you can move on with your second. So overall, if we were to recap, there's a few things that you have to consider in this principal residence tax exemption. If you only had one property during the whole time that you had this residence, you bought it and you sold it, it's pretty easy. You apply the principal residence tax exemption on all of those years that you had this property. But what happens if you have two property for this whole duration of time? So you bought them both in the specific year and you sold them both in the specific year. Well, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, which of the two residents had a greater appreciation in dollar terms on a yearly basis? And that house is the one that should have that principal residence tax exemption applied to, because that's the one that's going to lead to the most savings in terms of income tax owed. And then afterwards, the second thing that you have to keep in mind is, with this formula, you have this plus 1. So if you think about all of these years that you've owned both properties, you bought them and sold them in all of these same years, if you don't plan on buying another property that year that you're selling them both because you're going to travel the world, well, then you could also think about using that final year to apply it to your second property. That way, let's say you've owned both for 10 years. Well, the first 9 years are applied to the one that's gained the most, plus 1, so 10 over 10. All of the gains are tax exempt. And then the second property, you say you've owned it for 1 year, 1 plus 1 equals 2 out of 10, so 20% of those gains are tax exempt. So that's if you buy both at the same time and you sell both in the same year without thinking of buying another property. Then it muddles the whole idea there, because if you use that final year where you sell them both as principal residence for the second one, well, that year cannot apply to the other one. And it could work out. That's why the plus 1 exists, because the other property, if you buy and sell for the following 5 years, you still get that +1, which could recuperate that. But at the end of the day, it's just something you have to keep in mind when you declare. And then the next thing that you want to consider is if you've bought 2 properties, regardless if they're bought at the same time or not, but you only sell one of them, should you declare that property as your principal residence? And the big idea here is, what do you think is the yearly gain that you have on this one versus what's the yearly gain that you're going to have on the property that you have not yet sold? If you expect a lot more gain coming from the property that is not yet sold, well, then you might want to avoid claiming principal residence for all the years that you've owned both to that first property that you sell, because then you cannot claim it for the second property the day you sell it. But if you think that the first property that you bought and sold, you've made a massive gain and you'll never see that same kind of gain with the second property because you're going to keep it for a long period of time and you think the prices are plateauing, well, in that case, it makes sense to claim principal residence on that first property. So we'll go through a series of exercises to make sure that you understand, you get your bearings right, and you think it through and you go through the process. So the day that this happens to you, if you've owned more than one property, you know how to react. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing or joining my class where I guide you to apply and expand on the information found in these videos to real life examples. Have a good day.